Have you ever seen a four-star general, decorated, battle-hardened, and grieving, have a gun shoved to his head at his own son's funeral? This isn't fiction. This happened. General Marcus Hale stood in full uniform, stars on his shoulders, pain in his eyes, when a police officer interrupted the sacred burial of his son, a fallen soldier, and accused him of a crime he didn't commit. Right there in front of the flag-draped casket, in front of veterans, clergy, and God himself. If you've served this country, if you've ever folded a flag for someone you love, this story will strike a chord deep in your soul. Because what came next uncovered a web of corruption that reached far beyond one funeral and one father's pain. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe honor doesn't end when the war does, stay with us. This isn't just a story. This is a reckoning. The sky above Arlington National Cemetery was a soft gray, heavy, still, and reverent. Flags lined the winding path like sentinels of silence, their stars and stripes whispering in the wind. Rows of white headstones stretched endlessly across the green fields, each one bearing a name, a date, a sacrifice. General Marcus Hale stood at the center of it all. He wasn't here today as a commanding officer or a decorated hero. Not as the first black four-star general in the U.S. Island Army, not as the man who'd led troops across Fallujah, Kandahar, and Mosul. He was here as a father, a grieving, broken father burying his only son. Lieutenant Darren Hale had died in Syria, just shy of his 32nd birthday. The official report called it an ambush, the kind of loss every military family fears. But today wasn't about questions. It was about closure, about laying his boy to rest with the dignity he'd earned. The bugler raised the horn. The honor guard folded the flag slowly, each motion crisp, ceremonial, sacred. Marcus stood motionless, his back straight, his chest heavy beneath a row of medals that now felt hollow. He hadn't shed a tear. Not yet. Not when they delivered the news. Not when they returned the body. Not when they handed him his son's dog tags in a plastic bag. He had learned long ago to bury pain deep, but when the folded flag was placed in his hands, something inside him cracked. Then, chaos. "General Hale, step away from the flag!" The voice came sharp, aggressive, out of place, like a slap in a church. Gasps rippled through the mourners as a white police sergeant in full tactical gear pushed through the honor guard and drew his sidearm, aiming it squarely at Marcus's temple. "You're under arrest," the officer barked, sweat glistening on his brow. "For what?" Marcus said, voice low, steady. "You reached for a weapon." There were no weapons, no threat, just a folded flag, a grieving father, and a funeral that should have been sacred. But the officer pressed the barrel to Marcus's head. A scratch opened beneath his eye, blood staining the edge of his Medal of Honor. And still no one moved. 20 officers stood by. Not one stepped in, not one lowered their weapon, not one asked why. In that moment, unblinking, unbowed, General Hale whispered only 3 words: "Not today, son." The silence shattered. One officer fired into the air. Panic erupted. The flag fell into the dirt. Marcus was tackled to the ground, cuffed, humiliated, while his son's casket lay open behind him, and still no one moved. They thought they could silence a father with force. They thought they could bury the truth alongside the dead. But they didn't know Marcus Hale. Not yet. The ride home was painfully quiet. General Marcus Hale sat in the bottom of a government-issued black SUV, still in his dress blues, creased, blood-specked, and stained with Georgia clay. His hands, once bound in steel cuffs, rested motionless on his knees. Outside, the streets of Washington passed by in a blur of red lights and silence. Not even the driver spoke. No apology, no explanation, just distance between the cemetery and what was left of home. When he finally stepped through the front door of his modest 2-story house in northern Atlanta, it was Amara, his daughter, who rushed into his arms. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she sobbed. "They tried to bury more than Darren today." He didn't say anything at first. He just held her, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. There was something hollow about the way he stood. He had carried wounded soldiers out to burning Humvees, survived ambushes in no man's land, and walked out of Pentagon hearings with his honor intact. But nothing, not even war, had prepared him for the helplessness of this day. That night, the house felt too big, too empty. In Darren's old room, Marcus sat on the edge of the twin bed his son had once slept in, long before boot camp, before officer school, before Syria. The walls were lined with football trophies, ROTC awards, and a faded U.S. flag tacked above the headboard. The air smelled faintly of old wood and aftershave. He ran his hand along the edge of the desk, and then he saw it. A white envelope, taped beneath the drawer. Neat handwriting, all uppercase. "Dad, read this if something happens to me." Marcus opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small USB flash drive. "Dad, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I know you taught me to follow the chain of command. I know you taught me to trust the uniform, but something's not right here. I've been followed, harassed, even pulled from missions I was assigned to. There's a group inside Georgia law enforcement. Some of them are former military. They call themselves the Centurions. They think they're patriots, but really, they're cowards hiding behind the flag. And they see black officers, especially ones like me, as a threat to the order. I've been tracking them for months. I've recorded everything. I know they've made contact with someone in the Pentagon. If I die, don't let them write the story for me. Don't trust the department. Don't trust anyone in uniform, except you." Darren Marcus stared at the letter for a long time. The words blurred, his throat tightened. Then he plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The files loaded slowly. Dozens of folders, documents, videos, audio recordings, some dated back over a year. There were surveillance photos of Georgia state officers gathered in rural parking lots wearing matching silver rings, secret memos, deployment rosters with unexplained changes, a list of names, black service members, officers, all from southern bases, many of whom had been discharged or reassigned under questionable circumstances. One face appeared again and again, Officer John Mercer, the same man who'd shoved a gun into Marcus's face at Darren's funeral. At the bottom of the file tree was a single folder labeled Prescott. Inside, a brief note from Darren. "This is the man giving the orders, U.S. Senator Alan Prescott, former Army colonel, current chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, tied to the Centurions, tied to me being deployed early, tied to why I'm not coming home." Marcus's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragedy of war. It was a setup, a hit. And now the same forces that targeted his son were coming for him. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't finish the job. Marcus Hale closed the laptop slowly, walked to the hallway closet, and reached behind an old lockbox. Inside was his field journal, a burner phone, and a single photo of Darren smiling in uniform, his arm around Amara. He whispered to no one. They came after the wrong man. The war wasn't over. It had just come home, the whistleblower. It was just after 6 a.m. when the doorbell rang. General Marcus Hale had barely slept. He'd spent the night combing through Darren's files, document after document, detailing a secret network embedded within law enforcement in military circles. A network that saw patriotism not as service, but as control. He approached the front door cautiously, gripping a service pistol he hadn't touched since retirement. Through the frosted glass, he saw a slim young man in plain clothes, no uniform, no badge, just a worn gray hoodie and anxious eyes. Marcus opened the door slowly, gun still hidden at his side. "General Hale," the man asked quietly. "I am. My name's Victor Tran. I worked with your son." That stopped Marcus cold. Victor stood stiffly on the porch, twisting a baseball cap in his hands. He looked barely 30, with a military haircut grown out just enough to show he was off duty. But his eyes were sharp, tired, haunted. Marcus stepped aside. "Come in." Inside the kitchen, Victor sat across from him at the oak table, once the place where Darren did homework, where Amara laid out college brochures, where Marcus and his late wife used to drink late-night coffee in silence. "I'm sorry about Darren," Victor said, voice low. "He was one of the best men I ever knew, and I should have come forward sooner." Marcus didn't speak. He let the silence press until Victor filmed it. We met during a community task force, mix of local cops and military liaisons. On paper, it was meant to improve civilian-military coordination. But Darren started noticing patterns: harassment reports, false citations, surveillance on black officers, especially those with rising careers. Victor took a breath. At first, I told him to back off, keep his head down, but he wouldn't. He kept digging. He pulled a small flash drive from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. He gave me this as a backup, told me if anything happened to him, I needed to find you. Marcus plugged it into the same laptop from the night before. More files, audio clips, photos. Internal memos stamped confidential. They showed private meetings between officers, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, wearing identical silver rings etched with the Roman numeral C, the Centurions. One audio file played back a whispered conversation from the break room of a police precinct. We're not just keeping the streets clean. We're keeping the chain of command clean. No more rising stars from the wrong background. The colonel's got our back. Victor nodded. That colonel? It's Senator Prescott. He wasn't just giving speeches in Washington, he was giving orders. Then came the mission logs. Marcus stared at them, unblinking. According to official Pentagon records, Darren's unit, Bravo Company, 5th Infantry, had originally been stationed near the outskirts of Manbij, Syria. It was supposed to be a low-threat zone, but suddenly, with no combat alerts, Darren's team was reassigned to a volatile checkpoint near Raqqa, an area under constant drone surveillance because of insurgent activity. The reassignment came 2 days after a request from a Senate liaison attached to Prescott's office. Victor laid a printed email chain on the table. Subject line, Redeployment Unit B015. Sender, Office of Senator Alan Prescott. Recipient, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, CENTCOM. Message, priority request, shift to forward position ASAP, no public documentation. Handle quietly. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the paper. He didn't just die in combat, Marcus whispered. He was placed there, like a pawn. Victor nodded grimly. They wanted him gone, sir, because he knew too much, because he was brave enough to say something. A long pause filled the kitchen. Marcus stood slowly. His voice was calm, steady, the way it had always been before giving orders that would change lives. What about you? Why come to me now? Victor swallowed hard. Because I've seen what happens when you stay silent too long, and because I owe him that much. For the first time since the funeral, Marcus allowed his jaw to unclench, not in comfort, in purpose. He looked down at the flash drive, then at the photo of Darren on the fridge, smiling in uniform, frozen in time. You're not the only one who owes him, Marcus said quietly. They think they've silenced the story. He looked Victor dead in the eye, and then we write the rest. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Marcus Hale's house, a quiet, rhythmic warning that something was coming. He hadn't slept again. The morning news was ablaze with stories about his arrest at Arlington. Grainy cell phone videos had leaked, some blurred, others painfully clear. Headlines flashed across every network. Decorated general arrested at son's funeral. Police use force on grieving veteran. Hero or threat, the Marcus Hale controversy. There was no mention of Darren, no investigation into why a man in uniform had been treated like a criminal beside his son's casket. No questions about what led to a gun being drawn during a sacred military ceremony. The system wasn't staying silent. It was rewriting the narrative. By noon, Marcus had 3 missed calls from Pentagon contacts. By 3:00 p.m., his military email account was deactivated. By 4:30, the Army's Public Affairs Office issued a statement saying General Hale's conduct was under review. It didn't stop there. That evening, Marcus received a call from his bank. 3 of his accounts had been flagged. Suspicious activity. Someone had tried to transfer $150,000 out of his pension reserve. Another attempt was made to close his mortgage account. The voice on the phone said the requests were digitally verified. His signature was on file. He hadn't touched any of them. That same night, Amara came storming through the front door, soaked in rain, eyes wide with rage. They froze your clearance. she said, throwing a wet manila folder on the table. They're calling you a data risk. Classified access revoked. No court order, just a department memo with no signature. Marcus opened the folder. The paperwork was thin, 3 printed pages stamped internal review only. The reasons for suspension were vague: unauthorized data exposure, suspicious communication, breach of retirement protocol. It read like a script, one used many times before on others who had come too close to truth. They're cutting you off, Amar said, voice shaking. Isolating you, and if we don't act fast, they're going to erase you. He nodded slowly, staring at the paper. This is how they do it. Not with bullets, with silence. Then came the knock on the door. 2 men in plain clothes stood outside, badges barely visible under their jackets. General Marcus Hale, one said flatly. We're here with a federal warrant. For what? Amara snapped, stepping between them and her father. Possession of restricted information. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't resist. They cuffed him without reading his rights. The drive to the Atlanta Metropolitan Detention Center was long, quiet, and soaked in the hum of tires on wet asphalt. Marcus sat in the back seat, hands behind his back, watching the city he once served blur past. Inside, the cold concrete walls of the facility seemed designed to erase the human spirit. He was fingerprinted 6 times, stripped, searched. Dressed in an oversized gray jumpsuit, his Medal of Honor, still stained from the funeral, was sealed in a plastic evidence bag. They placed him in solitary confinement. No phone call, no legal counsel, no clock to mark time. Every 15 minutes, a guard slammed a baton against the door. Still awake, hero? One sneered. Marcus didn't respond. He just sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at nothing. Not because he was defeated, but because he was calculating. He'd been a soldier too long to panic, too long to break easily, but even he couldn't deny the way the cell worked on him. The cold, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the drip of a leaking pipe that never stopped. Every detail chipped away at a man's sense of time, of self, of purpose. The worst part wasn't the solitude. It was the knowledge that this machine had done this before, to others, quietly, efficiently. On the second night, a voice came from the next cell over. You must be the general. He turned slightly. I'm Teresa Jacobs, National Guard. They buried me in here 5 years ago, accused me of leaking intel after I filed a discrimination complaint. I've seen this game. He moved closer to the wall. Why are you still here? They make sure no one listens, no one cares. They expect us to give up, and most do. But I heard about you, saw the footage. There was a pause. You're the first one who ever made them afraid. Later that night, when the lights dimmed, barely, Marcus sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the faint reflection of himself in the steel toilet. It wasn't the face of a general anymore. It was the face of a man stripped of everything except his purpose. They thought they could end it here. That shame, cold floors, and paperwork would do what bullets couldn't. They were wrong. Because outside these walls, the truth was still breathing. And Marcus Hale wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. It started with one image, a grainy cell phone clip, just 27 seconds long. It showed a police officer aiming his gun at a grieving general during a military funeral. No context, no explanation, just raw, undeniable horror. It hit the internet like a lightning bolt. Within hours, veterans forums lit up. By nightfall, national news anchors struggled to explain what they were seeing, why a decorated 4-star general had been arrested at his son's funeral, why no one had intervened, why the military remained silent. And in the middle of it all was Amara Hale. She stood on the courthouse steps the morning after her father was taken. The rain had cleared, but the storm was far from over. In one hand, she held a manila folder of legal documents. In the other, her father's folded funeral flag, still stained with red Georgia dirt. To the press, she said, voice steady but sharp, you call this an incident. To us, it was a message, a warning, a punishment. But here's my message back to you. My father will not disappear, not while I have a voice, not while this flag still means something. She didn't cry, she didn't stutter, and in that moment, her words traveled farther than any bullet ever could. By nightfall, the hashtag had Justice for General Hale was trending nationwide. Veterans in New Mexico stood outside their local VA center, holding signs that read, "You can't cuff honor." In Philadelphia, a group of retired Marines marched in full-dress uniform past City Hall, carrying photos of Darren Hale and chanting, "Folded flags, not folded truth." The next day, Grady Memorial Hospital's ER reported a former cop, Victor Tran, had been admitted with blunt force trauma to the head. No witnesses, no CCTV, no suspects. Amara arrived at his bedside the moment the news reached her. His face was bruised, lips split, one arm in a sling, but he managed to speak. "They're watching, all of us," he whispered. "They took my phone, my laptop, but I hid a copy of the files under the floorboard. Unit 4B, tell Marcus, it's still there." Amara's throat tightened. "You saved everything?" He nodded weakly. "Elijah told me to never delete the truth. I won't." She squeezed his hand. "You won't be forgotten, I promise." By the end of the week, 1,000 veterans gathered outside the Atlanta Metropolitan Detention Center. They came from Tennessee, Texas, Colorado. Some wore medals, others came in wheelchairs. They lined the fences, holding flags upside down, a symbol of national distress. Chaplains read prayers over megaphones. A gospel choir sang "America the Beautiful" with tears in their eyes. Inside his cell, Marcus Hale heard them. Not through the walls, but through the echo in his own chest. A rhythm of defiance. A heartbeat that said, "You are not alone." On the fourth night of his confinement, the knock on his door wasn't from a guard. It was a whisper from the other side. "General Hale," the voice said softly. "My name's Officer Lucinda Reyes. My brother served under you in Fallujah. He said you saved his life. I believe that. That's why I'm here." A tray slid through the slot. Inside wasn't just food, it was a burner phone, hidden beneath a napkin. 3 words were scrawled in pen, "Do not give up." Marcus turned it on. 1 bar, 1 missed call. Amara. He dialed. It connected. "Dad?" Her voice broke. "Oh my God, they told us you were in isolation. They blocked everything." "I'm okay," he said calmly. "How's Victor?" "Hurt, but alive. He hid the files. We have them." "Good," he whispered. "Prescott?" "We've connected him to 3 deployment orders, all flagged, all targeting black officers. And Dad, one of the emails had your name. They were planning to discredit you even before Darren died." Marcus closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation. "Then it's worse than we thought." "We've got allies now," Amara said. "Veteran organizations, civil rights groups, even some inside the Pentagon. They're calling for a congressional hearing." "And you?" "I'm leading it," she said, voice steady now. "You taught me to fight smart." He smiled faintly. "Then it's time we finish what Darren started." That night, as protests swelled and cameras swarmed the detention center gates, a judge's emergency order arrived by courier. General Marcus Hale to be released pending investigation. At sunrise, the steel doors creaked open. Marcus stepped into the morning light, wearing the same gray jumpsuit they had stripped him into, but his back was straight, his eyes unbroken. Across the street, a line of veterans stood at attention. As one, they saluted. And somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the speeches and cameras, Marcus could almost hear Darren's voice. "You kept your promise, Dad." But Marcus knew the war wasn't over. The enemy wasn't on foreign soil anymore. They wore suits now, and the battlefield was Washington. The silence inside the Atlanta police headquarters was deceptive. Outside, crowds still chanted, signs waved in the humid Georgia air, and camera crews jockeyed for space. But within the thick glass walls of the command floor, the noise became a distant hum, just the way Chief John Mercer liked it. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by 2 lieutenants and a department legal advisor who hadn't said a word since the meeting began. He didn't expect Marcus Hale to walk through the doors. He certainly didn't expect him to walk in tall, calm, and dressed not in military uniform, but in a plain navy blazer and crisp slacks, as if he hadn't just emerged from solitary confinement with bruises on his wrists and a media storm at his back. Marcus entered the room without waiting for an invitation. Chief Mercer looked up slowly and smiled. Well, well, the general returns. You're looking better than you did face down in the grass. Marcus didn't flinch. He took the seat across from Mercer and laid a simple black folder on the table. I didn't come here to talk about the funeral, he said flatly. I came here to talk about Darren. The chief leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. That's so. Marcus opened the folder and pulled out a single photo. It showed Mercer in plain clothes standing in a group of men outside a VFW hall in rural Georgia. Each man wore the same silver ring, the same symbol that had shown up in every one of Darren's files. The Centurions. Mercer glanced at it unimpressed. Nice picture. You know how many veteran groups I'm part of? I know how many Darren was investigating, Marcus said evenly, and how many of those officers had ties to selective redeployments, suspicious discharges, surveillance on black soldiers. Mercer's grin faded just slightly. You sure you want to start throwing stones, General? Not a good look, especially after what you've been through. A man could get accused of being unstable. Marcus reached to adjust the lapel of his blazer. A quiet click sounded, a signal too faint for anyone in the room to catch. Inside his jacket, a high-definition voice recorded the year, wired by Agent Carter and approved under a DOJ whistleblower program, began capturing every word. Let me ask you something, Chief, Marcus said. Why was Darren reassigned to a forward position in Raqqa after a direct message from Senator Alan Prescott's office? You and I both know that wasn't protocol. Mercer narrowed his eyes. Your son was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's war. No, that was murder. The room tensed. The legal advisor shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Mercer stood up slowly, walked to the window, and watched the crowds below. He spoke without turning around. You ever hear of cleaning the chain of command, General? That's what we were doing. For years. Quietly. Surgically. No one noticed, until your boy came sniffing where he shouldn't have. He turned, smile returning, but colder this time. He was smart, brave, but he didn't understand order. He didn't understand that some men are born to lead and some are born to follow. Senator Prescott gets that. He knows what's worth preserving. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. You mean preserving power and keeping men like Darren from rising? Exactly. The room fell into dead silence. Then Mercer chuckled and sat back down. You came here to trap me, didn't you? Marcus didn't answer. Mercer tapped the folder. Whatever you're holding, it's not enough. You think anyone in that crowd out there wants to believe their country's rotting from the inside? Marcus stood. They already do, and now they have proof. Outside, Amara sat in an unmarked SUV, headset pressed to her ear, eyes wide. You got him, she whispered. Every word. The moment Marcus stepped out of the building, Agent Dominic Carter was already on the phone with federal prosecutors. By nightfall, the recording had made its way to the Department of Justice. And more importantly, to 3 key journalists with national reach. The next morning, every major network played the same 20-second clip. Your son didn't understand order. Prescott does. That's what we were preserving. Prescott denied everything, of course. He called it political sabotage, a smear campaign. But the court of public opinion was already assembling a jury. That same night, Marcus stood on the steps of a community center in East Atlanta, where over 200 people had gathered, candles in hand. He held Darren's folded flag close to his chest as he looked out at the crowd. I didn't come here tonight as a general, he said. I came here as a father, as a man who served this country for 3 decades, and who now knows that the real war isn't fought overseas. He paused, scanning the crowd. It's fought in silence, in systems, in shadows. And I'm here to shine a light. The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus didn't smile. He simply nodded once and stepped back. Because the trap had been set, and next it was Prescott's turn to fall in. The sun rose pale over Capitol Hill, casting a golden haze over the marble pillars and stone steps of the Dirksen Senate office building. The air was heavy with anticipation, cameras lining every walkway, reporters murmuring into microphones like the calm before a courtroom storm. Inside, the hearing room buzzed. For once, every seat was filled. Senators leaned into murmured conversations with aides. Gold Star families held framed photos in their laps. Retired generals sat ramrod straight in rows beside civil rights attorneys. The crowd wasn't just here for testimony. They were here for a reckoning. General Marcus Hale stood just behind the double doors, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He wore his full Army service uniform, every ribbon polished, every crease sharp. On his chest, just above the heart, gleamed his Medal of Honor, returned to him after a formal military apology 2 days prior. Amara stood beside him in a tailored black suit and white blouse. She looked at him, not as a lawyer, not as an advocate, but as a daughter. "You ready, Dad?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "They're the ones who should be afraid." The doors opened. All rose. General Hale stepped forward, the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Federal Oversight, a graying, stoic figure from Illinois, gestured toward the witness table. "General Hale," he said into the microphone, "thank you for being here today. We are prepared to receive your testimony regarding unlawful redeployments, racial targeting within military and law enforcement institutions, and the death of Lieutenant Darren Hale." Marcus adjusted the mic. His voice, when it came, was deep, clear, and unwavering. "My name is General Marcus Hale. I have served the United States Army for 33 years. I have commanded troops in 3 wars. I have walked into combat zones with men and women of every background, every belief, every corner of this country, and I have brought too many of them home in boxes." He paused. The room held its breath. "I never thought one of those boxes would carry my son." He reached into a leather folder and pulled out Darren's deployment orders. Then he placed the printed emails beside them, each marked by the same name in the sender field, Senator Alan Prescott. "This committee has before it evidence that a United States Senator used his office to influence military deployments, not for national security, but to silence a junior officer who was investigating a covert domestic network of racial extremists operating within law enforcement and military systems. That officer was my son." Gasps rippled through the room. He continued, "Lieutenant Darren Hale found evidence that black officers were being surveilled, reassigned, discharged under false pretenses, sometimes injured or worse. He followed the trail. It led to local precincts, to retired military contractors, and ultimately to the Centurions, a shadow group of self-proclaimed defenders of American purity. Their goal wasn't to protect the nation. It was to control who represents it." The screens behind him flickered on. Video clips played. Mercer's confession, surveillance photos, deployment maps, audio of Prescott's voice giving recommendations for redeployment. Senator Prescott, seated stiffly at the far end of the room, glared silently across the table, his hands folded tightly. Then came the last clip, a voice recording of Darren, shaky but composed. "If you're hearing this, I'm probably gone. But the truth isn't. Not anymore." The room fell completely silent. Marcus looked out across the chamber. "I came here today not as a grieving father or a retired general. I came as a citizen who still believes this country can live up to the promises we made when we first put on the uniform, to protect each other, to fight for truth, and to stand for justice." He took a breath. "I'm not asking for revenge. I'm demanding accountability." The chairman leaned forward. "General Hale, do you believe Senator Prescott intentionally ordered the redeployment of your son into a hostile zone?" "I do. And that it was part of a coordinated effort to silence him?" "I believe it was an execution, disguised as strategy." That word landed like a gavel. Before the session could adjourn, 3 federal marshals entered the chamber and approached Senator Prescott. "Senator Alan Prescott," one read aloud, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, unlawful use of federal authority, and negligent homicide in the death of Lieutenant Darren Hale." Prescott rose, face burning red, and barked at the chairman. "This is a witch hunt, an orchestrated attack." But the cameras were already rolling, and America was already watching. As he was led away in cuffs, veterans in the crowd stood, one by one. Some saluted, some clapped, some just bowed their heads and wept. And as Marcus Hale stood beside Amara, he didn't raise his fist. He didn't cheer. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and took out Darren's dog tags. He held them up for all to see, one final symbol of a son who died not because he broke the rules, but because he exposed the ones who had already shattered them. 1 year later, the morning at Arlington National Cemetery was still unclear, as if even the wind understood the weight of the day. There were no protest signs now, no cameras, no chaos, only reverence. A new memorial stood at the edge of the eastern field, polished granite rising 4 feet high, simple and strong. It bore no political logos, no speeches etched in marble, just a name and a promise. Lieutenant Darren M. Hale, 1989, 2023. He served with honor, he died for truth, his voice still speaks. General Marcus Hale stood before the stone, alone at first. Dressed in his service blues, every button fastened, each medal exactly where it belonged. In his hands was the folded flag that had once fallen into the dirt, the same one he'd lifted back up with bruised wrists and unbroken will. Behind him, the crowd gathered slowly, veterans from every branch, officers young and old, families with photos of loved ones, ministers, civilians, journalists who once stayed silent, now taking notes with care. And beside Marcus stood Amara, now the director of the newly formed National Integrity Foundation for Military and Law Enforcement Accountability, an organization created in Darren's name to protect those who speak truth to power. To her right was Victor Tron, healed, uniform, pressed, promoted, and now heading the task force investigating hate-based groups within government systems. They were proof that Darren's life hadn't ended in vain. As the service began, no one said his rank. They simply said his name. Amara stepped forward to speak. Her voice was stronger than ever, but it trembled at first. My brother wasn't famous. He didn't command armies. He didn't wear stars. But he knew what they meant. He believed in service. He believed in his father. And most of all, he believed in the country that raised him. She paused, letting the silence breathe. And when that country failed him, he didn't stay quiet. He didn't fold, and neither did my father. She looked back at Marcus, then out at the hundreds standing shoulder to shoulder in respectful silence. There are two kinds of patriotism, she continued, one that wraps itself in a flag and hides behind power, and another that lives the meaning of that flag, even when it costs everything. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stepped slowly to the podium. His voice, though softer with age, still held the weight of a man who had commanded thousands and buried too many. I once believed that duty was about loyalty, he began. To the flag, to the uniform, to the chain of command. He looked down at the stone. But my son reminded me that duty is deeper than that. It's about protecting what's right, even when the system gets it wrong. He turned to the crowd. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You don't have to stand on a battlefield to be brave. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought right here, at home, in the halls of justice, in the court of truth, in the hearts of those who've been told to stay silent. He paused. So if you remember anything from today, remember this. Silence protects power. Courage protects people. Then he placed the flag gently at the foot of Darren's memorial and stepped back. A bugler played taps, and as the final note drifted over the lawn, a single bald eagle soared high above the trees, silent, steady, alone against the vast blue sky. In the end, the legacy of Darren Hale is not just about justice. It's about what we're willing to risk for what's right. It's about speaking truth, even when it hurts. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't shout, but endures. If you believe that honoring our veterans means more than waving a flag, if you believe that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is worth defending, then don't let this story end here. Share this with someone who still believes in integrity. Tell us where you were watching from, and if this story moved you, tell us why. And above all, never stay silent when you know what's right, because justice doesn't remember medals. It remembers the people who refuse to give up.